Welcome everyone to the 9th gathering of our spring Morehead-Cain event season. For today's 7 Talk, we are so happy to welcome Takhona Hlatshwako in the class of 2022, who will talk about the intersection of culture, health, and storytelling, and why responsible storytelling matters. Takhona, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Megan. I am incredibly honored to have been invited to do this talk. I want to start by sharing a short story, right on brand. This is a story I first heard told by Dr. Donald Wan in one of my public health classes. In the story, there are 3 sisters walking along a river. As they're walking, they see that there's a group of children drowning in the water. The first sister says, "This is a crisis. I'll jump in and save them." The second sister says, "No, we need to teach them how to swim so that they can survive in the water." The third sister keeps walking upstream. The 2 sisters get confused. They look at her and say, "Why aren't you helping us?" The third sister responds, "I am going to find out who is putting these children in the water in the first place, and I'm going to stop them." As you can tell, these 3 sisters have very different approaches to solving a problem. And I can tell you that the third sister definitely majored in public health, just like I am. Today, I want to touch on her approach. I specifically want to touch on what she says to the 2 other sisters when she comes back, how she tells the story of what is wrong with these children. If you take anything away from my talk, I hope you take away this: how you tell a story, any story, matters. We tell stories every day. We share on social media what we ate for breakfast this morning, or our dog did a crazy stunt on TikTok, or how we vacationed in a foreign country over the summer. We tell stories about the people we met, how they spoke, how they ate, how they lived their lives. We paint a picture, and that picture comes alive in the minds of the people who hear our story. In my culture, storytelling is intertwined with our identity. I know the battles my forefathers fought, the roads they traveled, and the things they loved, all through stories. Life lessons are taught to the next generation through folk tales we call tinganekwane. Through stories, we're able to pass down our culture the way my elders did, but we are also able to share our culture between communities, like I am doing now. Now, the question is, how do we tell stories about cultures that are not our own? How do we make sure our storytelling is informative and not performative? How do I, for example, talk about the Black experience in America to my African brothers and sisters without reducing the lived experiences of many to a hashtag on Instagram? I certainly do not know or have all of the answers to these questions, and certainly cannot give them to you in 7 minutes, but perhaps we can start a conversation. Maybe I can spark something here that is meaningful, that helps us all to become better storytellers. I often find myself caught between several places, several communities, several cultures. Over the past summer, I was at home in Eswatini when Black Lives Matter protests were happening all over the US and around the world, saying enough is enough. My international friends on the outside seemed to want to debate, and it made my blood boil. And in the fall, I was in Zoom University with my classmates here while a war was taking place between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I lived in Armenia for 2 years before moving to the US. I had met and talked with people who were now fighting a war while I sat in class and stared at a Zoom screen. Sadly, there were not enough headlines. And at the beginning of 2020, I was studying abroad in Sweden, and then a pandemic broke out. I scrambled to get the first flight home. And shortly after I left, I saw multiple headlines on how Sweden was apparently being quite relaxed in their response to the pandemic, and how that supposedly had a lot to do with the culture in Sweden. Needless to say, there were some questionable headlines. In all of these instances, people on the outside were either telling stories about these places that I felt weren't accurately representing the truth, or simply weren't talking about it at all. I struggled with how to convey my experiences having lived there without misrepresenting the truth. Did I even know the truth? What gave me the right to speak on anything? I think that is a feeling many of us have experienced, especially about things that do not affect us directly. But what I've learned is that sometimes silence is very loud and it can drown out the important voices that need to be amplified. When we choose not to be silent, the stories we tell may not be perfect, but they are like seeds we plant in the ground. Others can help us to water them, nourish the soil they are put in, and if any weeds start to show, they can help us to uproot them. Those weeds, those are our implicit biases, our ignorance, our miseducation. We should not be so afraid to not show our weeds that we prefer to sit on the sidelines and watch others do the hard work of tending to the garden. So tell the story respectfully and thoughtfully and with humility. And if you can't, amplify the stories that are already out there, the important ones. Well, my short story is I was born and raised in Eswatini, which some of you may know as Swaziland. If you do know my little home country, you probably know one of two facts. One, Eswatini is the last absolute monarchy in Africa. Yes, we have a king and a queen and not a president. Or two, you know that we have held the record of having the highest HIV prevalence in the entire world for many years. I didn't know the term public health until I was in high school. What I knew was that in my country and in my community, there was this disease that was tearing families apart. I thought it was normal for people to die at age 48 or 49. I thought that's how long people lived. I later learned that this is called an epidemic and that it is not normal and it should never be. The same way that gun violence is an epidemic. But back to my point, the story of sickness and disease and poverty in my country and in my continent is the story that preceded me wherever I went. And because of the way those stories were told, void of dignity and respect, it affected what people thought of me even before I opened my mouth to speak. Chimamanda Adichie calls this the danger of the single story. And I think that danger exists in public health too. I recognize that in public health, we try our best to communicate what we find, to communicate why there are children drowning in the water. To me, public health is all about stories, but we would be remiss to tell these stories without cultural humility, without an awareness of our own biases and beliefs, and an acknowledgement of our own miseducation. How we tell a story matters. We have seen this to be true during the pandemic, especially in the beginning when there was a lot of fear and misinformation spreading. Needless to say, the story wasn't being told very well. Lives have been threatened, lives have been lost as a result of the way in which COVID-19 was being talked about. There were and still are stories everywhere. There are so many things that are happening, and we cannot control all of them. But we can be conscious of the stories that we consume, that we share, that we help spread, because they can have very real impacts on the people that those stories are about. We also have to realize that there are untold stories of resiliency, sacrifice, and community. Stories hidden from the people on the outside looking in. And that is why cultural humility is so important. Humbly recognizing that there are things we don't know or understand, and therefore our stories will always be incomplete. To take it back to my illustrations, I mentioned how the media was portraying Sweden as not taking the virus too seriously, and how they believed that was in line with the seemingly laid-back nature of Scandinavians. But when I was there in March, all the pharmacies had run out of sanitizers and masks because people were taking it seriously. At home in Eswatini, there were several headlines talking about how people were turning to a natural herb we call umhlonyane. But contrary to what the headline said, this is not because people didn't believe in modern medicine. Rather, people were afraid. And because they were afraid, they turned to what had historically been used by our ancestors to fight an unknown enemy. And here there are several ongoing fights against the pandemic, against social injustice, against health disparities and inequity. There's a lot. I began this talk with a story about the children drowning in the water. Now, I have no doubt that the second sister has good intentions to want to teach the children how to swim so that they can survive in the water. And they might even be good swimmers one day and win Olympic gold medals. But that doesn't change the fact that they were born into a hostile environment. And yes, public health includes equipping people with the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to tell the best possible story with their lives. But that is not the same as simply teaching people how to swim. It is more about walking upstream and digging into the reasons why something is happening. That is where responsible storytelling comes in. Storytelling helps to create empathy. It helps us to see one another and to feel seen by each other. And when that is coupled with cultural humility, that is radical. That is saying, I see you. I don't see everything, but I see you. One day, I hope to be the third sister, seeking truth and solutions to public health challenges and sharing those solutions, but in a responsible, respectful, and humble manner. And I hope you'll all join me in this journey. Whatever field you're in, wherever you are, and even around the dinner table, we can all strive to become better and more responsible storytellers. Thank you. I'm excited to take some questions and flesh out some of these ideas more in conversation.
Wonderful. You're getting lots of love and clapping so far. Happy to take any questions for Takhona. All right, I'm happy to start off if I don't see any hands quite yet, and I'm sure people will warm up and jump in. We were talking before the talk began, and we were curious to know how you came up with your topic, and we'd love to hear a little more about that, the background to where you, how you got where you are today talking about these things.
Thank you, Megan. So I mentioned how in my first 2 years at UNC, I took a lot of creative writing classes. I'm a public health major, and I knew I wanted to be a public health major even before I came to UNC. It's the only reason UNC was even on my radar. But the public health major only starts in the junior and senior year, so the last 2 years. So I basically had like 2 years to take classes in literature, in creative writing, in Greek drama, I think I took in my first year as well, and directed an Agamemnon play. And so I've had, I guess, just some practice and passion for storytelling. And initially in my mind, I thought, well, once I go into public health, all of that's going to stop. Like creative writing aside, I'm going to focus on public health. But as I started taking public health classes and, reading studies, public health studies, and reading different interventions and solutions and how we attack problems in public health, I realized, no, the storytelling doesn't stop. It goes on, and it's a different form of storytelling. It's a lot more serious. But at the end of the day, we are just trying to get communities to be healthier. And sometimes that is a lot of storytelling because that's what people understand. So yeah, I guess that's how I came to this talk.
Wonderful. Tom Morris has a question for you next.
So I'll unmute myself. Boy, that was good. That was so good. My neurons are firing. My head is spinning. I mean, there's so many things. For example, I got up this morning and posted on social media about sowing seeds. that every day we sow seeds in the world and the world sows seeds in us, and how important it is to understand that two-way dynamic and use it well, and how the sowing of seeds for a great harvest is only one phase of a process of many phases that are then important. So what of those seeds do we cultivate within ourselves? What of those seeds do we cultivate in the world? So I just wanted to mention that. And secondly, I wanted to mention, I write a lot of books because I can't shut up. So I just finished my 31st book, and it's the first book I ever wrote. I'm a philosopher, and so everything I write is in some way philosophy. It's the first book I've ever written based in storytelling. I used Mary Shelley's famous novel, Frankenstein, that she wrote when she was 18 years old, to frame stories from Gilgamesh, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the plays of Sophocles, Beowulf, Frankenstein, not just Frankenstein, but her book, The Last Man, Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, Moby Dick, Don Quixote, all through the centuries. Because as a philosopher, I've come to realize too many of us tend to be abstract and just talk ideas, which are very important, but ideas embedded in stories are so much more important. And I wondered for a long time why we react to well-told stories so powerfully. And I've come to conclude it's because we each live our own story. And so anyone else's narrative that can shed light on our own, it's something we grab onto, the way one of those girls in the river might grab onto a life preserver, right? Because we move into uncertainty all the time. And stories that can be told by people who've gone before us give us a sense of orientation, a sense of our bearings. And I just wondered how you came to, I mean, you made some great connections today with empathy, for example. How did you come to understand that yourself, empathy and storytelling? I think that's so important.
Thank you, Tom, for that great question. And so I think all through high school back at home, I very much lived in a bubble. Like I lived in a small country in the south of Africa. Nothing ever happens in Swaziland. And so I think there was always a yearning in me for something else, something more. I always thought to myself, there must be something more to this. And so I read a lot. Reading was my escape. Books of all kinds, fiction, nonfiction. And it opened up my world. It broadened up my world and introduced me to different ideas and I guess a new way of seeing the world. But just like you said, a lot of those ideas are very abstract and intangible. And so when I started interacting with the world a little more and traveling and studying abroad, and for example, when I lived in Armenia for 2 years and interacting with people so closely that I had almost nothing in common with, those personal stories, those are what I think really moved me more than the abstract ideas I read in books. And that was important as well, because I think it laid the conceptual foundation of a lot of the things that I believe in. And philosophy, for example, has helped me refine why I believe what I believe. And to me, adding on top of that, personal stories with people that I've met, that to me, I think it changes everything. And I think that is what has created or helped me understand empathy, that I can read about Americans in the news sitting at home in Eswatini. But living here is a different story. Living in Chapel Hill and having people open doors for me, that was wild to me. I was like, wait, why are you opening the door for me? That's something I never read in the newspapers. And so that personal interaction, it's changed everything and 10 things on its head for me.
It's interesting. You started by saying nothing had ever happened in your home country. Well, you happened, and that changed everything for us. But, you know, I used to tell my graduate students at Notre Dame, I taught a long time ago, I said, there are two approaches to writing books. One is the National Gallery model. One is the conversational model. In the National Gallery model, you've got to paint a masterpiece. and then send it to the world to be hung in the National Gallery of Great Books. People who have that model of writing write very few things in their life, or at least they publish very few things. The other model is the conversational model. As soon as you think you have something significant to say, to start a conversation or add to a conversation, go say it. Publish your book. I think the same thing is true of storytelling generally, that too many people are afraid to tell stories because they're afraid they won't do it perfectly in as polished a way as a famous author might. But if it starts a conversation, or if it enhances a conversation that's already going on, it's an important thing to contribute. And I encourage people to take that view of storytelling, because we don't have to just deal in finished masterpieces. If I tell you a great story, or if you tell me a great story, the listener, the hearer may then add a twist that makes it an even better story. And we prevent that from happening if we keep our stories to ourselves.
There's beauty in the imperfect, and so I completely agree.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Takhona, Emil Charles has a question for you.
Hi, Emil.
Hi, thank you so much for your incredible talk. I think as someone also interested in public health and I think global affairs and also just relationships, this is really fascinating. I wanted to ask about either some of the most inspiring stories that you've heard, and maybe some of the other ones that you've been able to tell.
Oh, wow, that is a loaded question. Most inspiring stories. Do you want that to be with public health or in general?
In general, if whatever first comes to mind.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to my time in Armenia, time and time again. I'm sorry. So I went to an international school in Armenia for the last 2 years of high school. And so my school brought together like 200 kids from around the world to sort of live in this weird experiment and of just a mix of cultures and languages. And so I met a lot of people that changed the way that I view the world and sort of put faces to names, right? We say Iraq, but now when I say Iraq, I think of my friend who comes from that country and who I got to know over the period of 2 years. And so one story I think that really comes to mind right now is one of my friends from Syria, and the story of how he came to Armenia where he is now, and the struggles he sort of had living in his country and not being able to go back. We had gone to Georgia for Christmas holidays, and there were protests happening in Georgia against immigrants. And he was there with his, taking photographs. But in that moment, it was so interesting to me how there were these protesters protesting against immigrants, especially from the Middle East. And he was there taking pictures of the protesters so that that story can be shared. And I thought that was just incredibly wild to me, because you would imagine someone to be incredibly crushed by that, by, the sentiment surrounding those protests. But he stood up and he said, this is also a story. I mean, who am I to judge whether there are stories that need to be told? When you look beneath the surface of why these protests are happening, there's fear, there's misinformation fueling the sort of anger and hate towards immigrants. And so he said, that story needs to be told as well. Why is there so much fear? Why is there so much misinformation? And seeing him stand up and sort of do that was so inspiring to me. And that's just the first thing that's coming off the top of my head.
Thank you so much.
Great question, Emil. Dave Brunson has a question for you, Takhona.
Yeah, Takhona, I liked what you said when you were describing about storytelling being informative and not performative. I think I got that right. I'm not a great note taker, but I think I wrote that right. How can we view stories nowadays as being honest when it seems so acceptable that people lie to enhance their story?
That is a great question. That word honest, I've struggled with that word, especially in this time of social media and just so many stories coming at us. Like, what is honest? What is truth? And so for me, I have answers to that spiritually and in my own spiritual life, and what are the things I consider truth. But also just in the world, like if I'm seeing the story on social media, how do I know that it's honest? And I think that's what your question is getting at. I always come down to do no harm. Do no harm. And so if I read a story online and, you know, there's some questionable things in there and I don't know what to believe, like, do I take the story as it is? Do I take it apart? I always come back to, is it doing harm? How much harm is being done? And so what does that mean for me? I absolutely believe in anything that we do, in the way that we move in the world and the stories that we tell, we should absolutely do no harm. And that's difficult. I recognize that that is difficult. But that sort of having that mindset has sort of helped me filter some of these stories that are coming at me, and just thinking about if the story is harmful, and then to me, that's not honest. If the story is harming communities and causing pain, to me, that is not honest. There may be facts in the story, but that's different from the narrative that the story is painting. If the narrative is harmful, I put that aside, and it is not something that I'm going to dwell on too much. And that's not just harm for me or people that are close to me, that's harm for any community. And so absolutely just do no harm.
Thank you.
Takhona, your next question is from Dr. Bob Carter.
Well, that was easy to follow because I'm a retired physician and we were always taught, don't do any harm. First, do no harm. And another thing was, don't make the evaluation of the problem worse than the problem, and don't make the treatment worse than the disease. That's my advice as a physician. But as you were talking, I looked up your country and I see that HIV is a big disease, plus tuberculosis. So I want to hear a little bit more about that too. And I want to hear a little bit about your journey, how you learned about the Morehead program and your journey to get to where you are, if you would. And while I was sitting here talking, I got to give you some public health advice for all of you. I did some yard work yesterday. We had a tornado come through Burlington last week. And so there are lots of limbs around. We fortunately stayed in our bathtub with our helmets and pillows, and it went over us and we didn't get any major damage. But I just looked at my leg and I found a little Lone Star tick on my leg. So you all in Chapel Hill, if you get outside, be careful. This is tick season. They're starting to wake up and get onto you. And have any of you heard of the alpha-gal syndrome? I have a classmate of mine from Chapel Hill who is a retired physician like me. And he woke up 2 or 3 years ago in the middle of the night, couldn't breathe, had to be taken to the hospital and intubated because of a severe anaphylactic reaction. And it was traced to him. He lived out in the country, I call it here. And he had developed the alpha-gal syndrome, which is a sensitivity to red meat. Sugar, excuse me. So, but watch for ticks now. But I want to hear about your journey as to the Morehead program.
Thank you for the question. So I think growing up and just seeing what HIV, the impact that HIV had on my community, I think naturally just got drawn to the health sciences. And so I think if anybody asked me what I wanted to become when I grew up, I'd say I want to be a doctor. And that was my answer for the longest time. And I think something shifted for me in high school when I think we covered a public health chapter in one of my biology classes. And so biology, obviously, I was going towards pre-med, but there was a specific, I guess, chapter section that we did on public health. And the way that my teacher explained it to me is that, the doctor deals with the patient, the public health professional deals with the community. And that, it's so simple, but it blew my mind. I was like, I want to help. I want to help my community in some way. And we need doctors back home. God knows we need doctors. But I realized that I was called to helping in a different way and helping communities at large, and that sort of wide impact that public health interventions can have. And especially with HIV, it needs a sort of systemic response. Like, it needs a structural response. It needs the public health institutions to respond in a way that can help alleviate the disease when we're talking nationally and internationally, globally. And so I think that's when I started moving away from medicine per se, but still within the health sciences. I still have a very big interest in the health sciences. And when I sat with my careers counselor and I told her that I want to study public health, she was like, have you heard about UNC? They have like one of the best public health schools in the world. And I was like, you don't say. And I put that on my list of colleges. And she said, I think you'd be great for this program. And she nominated me for the Morehead-Cain program. And, you know, the Morehead-Cain very generously flew me out from Armenia all through New York for a little trip down to Chapel Hill to do my interview. And when I set foot in Chapel Hill, I was like, this is it. This is where I want to be. And I'm here today.
Awesome. Chiazo has a question for you next.
Hi. You know, public health is super interesting to me because I had no idea what it was until I came to UNC as well. But I think it's also interesting how you brought up community, and I sort of want to bring it back to, you know, college kids. I know there's a couple of us on the call, but like how, especially with storytelling, you know, how do you think that the private stories, like the personal, like the stories we tell ourselves impacts public health, even just in the scope of all of us being on Zoom for the past year and taking classes, and like, how does that impact community? And like, what sort of, how do you navigate the stories you tell yourself and in these public health scenarios, but also like, you know, being a student and like navigating what that means now? That would be super interesting to hear. Like, do your classes tackle these type of things, or like, how have you as a future, you know, person in this field started to wrangle with this idea of the personal in the public health field?
That's a great question, Chiazo. Wow, I was just in a class lecture before this, and my public health professor was talking about human rights and how that has to do with public health. And he said something that was so interesting to me. He said that the challenge of public health is balancing communal good and individual liberties. And I think you can see this wherever you turn, right? That public health, because it is about communities, because it is about populations, there's a lot of decisions that are being made about what is good for everyone, for a whole community, for a whole population. And so what is the communal good? But at the same time, you cannot infringe on individual liberties. Like, people have the decision to choose what they want to do with their lives. And sometimes those decisions impact communities and populations. And so that is the challenge. Personally, what I've seen studying public health is that we can give people the most information. We can try and give them information about how to handle diabetes, how to handle heart disease, how to exercise, and how to sort of do that on a community level so that the whole community can become healthier. And so there's always information, education, and knowledge that is being shared in public health. But I realize that the challenge is that when it comes to making decisions personally on an individual level, very few people think on a community level. And that's difficult, right? If us as public health officials, me one day when I get my PhD, as public health officials, if we're trying to convince people to do this thing for the communal good, and yet individuals are acting in their best interests, there's a clash there. And the short answer to your question, Chiazo, is I don't know. I don't know how to navigate that challenge, because it is a challenge. And so I think I'm looking up to people who I admire in public health that are doing what I like to call radical public health, and so dismantling systems and not working within them. And I am looking to them for answers, because I realize that this is a challenge, and I realize the significance of it as well, because I also do things in my best interest as well that have to do with my individual liberties. And so if one day I have to work in this field where I am trying to encourage people to do things that are helpful on a community level, that's going to be difficult. And I realize it is going to be difficult, but it's a challenge, I'm willing to take up.
Thanks, Chiazo, for that. James Barnes has a question for you next.
Sure, thanks, Takhona. Great talk. And the question here is for you to look inside your head and tell us a story of what happens when you see a new public health data set.
Oh, like a study that was like a
no, not a study. So this is data versus story. Does the data tell a story to you that you read, or do you see the data or something else? Tell us what's happening in your head. What are you thinking and how are you feeling?
Wow, that is a good question. So I think I'm going to use an illustration for this, because this is the best way that's going to help me talk through this. I am currently working on a global survey. It's called the iShare study. It's being implemented in around 35 countries around the world. And it's looking at the impact of COVID-19 on sexual and reproductive health services around the world and access to sexual and reproductive health services around the world. And so looking at that data, firstly, it's global. And so I have just the rows starting from Argentina, because that's A, all the way to whatever country, Uruguay, because that's U. And so it's a big data set. And for me, the first thing that always comes into my mind is, how do I not make this one story? How do I not generalize what's happening in Argentina and try and apply it to what's happening to the US and Uruguay? And so that's something that I'm conscious about as I'm looking at the data. And so as I'm reading those rows and looking what's happening in Argentina with access to reproductive health services, I sort of have to stop myself when I get to the last Argentinian row and say, you know what, now I'm moving to Uruguay. This is a different setting. These are different people with different systems and different policies. And so I cannot take what I've already assumed and sort of concluded based on the Argentinian data and apply it to Uruguay. And so those are things that I have to work out in my mind and sort of shift between places and cultures and people. And then I also try and think about, especially with data, is from especially surveys, so self-administered surveys. If we're asking people health questions and we want to apply that to what's the solution going to be, I always ask myself, how did the question seem to the person answering the question? Because the question is different to me as the public health official asking that question, but how did it seem to the person answering the question? And so an example for this is gender. We, in public health, are trying to restructure the way we ask questions about gender. And so I think we have these systems in our head that, oh, we're going to ask, and these are the options that we're going to have. But for someone who's sitting at home, looking at the survey and looking at the options there, what feelings are they having? Do they feel represented in those options? And if they don't have an option that applies to them, how does that impact the way they're going to answer the rest of the survey? Because now what they're going to think, especially if there wasn't an option addressing them, is, well, what's the point of giving these people any more information if they couldn't get this one thing right? And so these are the things that I always ask myself when I look at data, is that there's so much happening. And the way that you see data changes when you try and see it from the perspective of the person giving you the data. So the person filling in the survey. To cut my answer short, a lot is happening in my head.
That's lovely. Thank you. And I would apply a mood of enthusiasm when you see a new data set from just the way you're talking. I don't know if that's true.
That's very true.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Thanks, James, for that. Takhona, Anna Ilyasova has a great question for you. She's going to turn on her audio and not her camera because she's in a car. She's not driving. She's being safe, but she's going to ask you a question real quick.
Hi, Takhona. Thank you again so much for your talk. It's definitely a privilege to be an HPM cohort with you. But so I have a question about, I guess, kind of, like what you've already been talking about in terms of the responsibility of storytelling in public health. So I guess maybe a lot of the stories that we might hear or share in public health could be kind of deeply personal or sensitive to people. And how do you think that we can kind of like encourage this storytelling in a way that doesn't also put pressure on people to have to feel like they have to share things that are really personal, or to like have this burden that they have to share, you know, extraordinarily personal or sensitive things?
That's such a great question, Anna. And I've thought about that before as well. And especially with things that happen that are incredibly sensitive. And so to create empathy, right? I mentioned that in my talk. To create empathy, it helps to have stories that people can connect to, and sort of help break down the different, you know, complex ideas into something personal that they can relate to and understand. I have sort of seen or learned in my short life journey, talking to people and listening to people share their life stories, is that the way that I approach them and in the way that I reflect my authenticity and genuine interest in what they have to tell me, that almost always affects the actual story that they tell me and how much of it they're going to share. And sometimes, you know, we think we're interested, but really I think we're interested in the surface level details that will confirm the things we already know and then keep it moving. And I think people can feel that energy when you're asking them to share something that has to do with their lives. I think it's almost always apparent that they're not listening. The eye contact is not there. The authenticity, the genuine interest is not there. And so I think that affects how people will then tell you your story. But I think your question, Anna, is more the people who are genuinely interested, who are saying, I really do want to understand, and how do I get you to tell me your story without putting some pressure on you? And I think it's difficult. I think every situation is going to be different. And I also think that sometimes there are people already out there telling similar stories that can teach us whatever it is that we're trying to learn. And so maybe not always put it on a specific type of person or specific type of community to teach us the things that we need to learn. There are other people out there that can share similar stories, that can give us similar themes and sort of help us conceptually understand things. And so I guess my short answer is, if it does feel like pressure, then probably don't put it on them. And I think there might be somewhere else or someone else who might be willing and able to tell that story in a way that can help. So I'm sorry, that's not a very satisfying answer.
No, that's really helpful. Thanks.
Dr. Carter has a follow-up question for you.
Yeah, in your interest in public health and in your studies, what do you think public health is going to do about population control to help improve the poverty of our children?
Population control, wow, that is a hot button topic. I'm going to say something controversial here, but it is a personal opinion. It's what I personally believe. I don't think we have a problem with overpopulation. I think we have a problem with mismanagement of the resources to take care of our populations. And so for me, it's really how do we do a better job of redistributing resources or distributing resources so that we all have enough, enough food, enough water, enough resources, and enough for the next generation as well. Unfortunately, I don't have, the data or evidence or the numbers that can help, support my argument. It is just a general feeling that I have that perhaps maybe we do have a population problem, but I think currently the bigger problem is the inequity in distribution of wealth and resources.
You're getting lots of applause. I don't know if you're able to see it on the screen. So good job going out on a limb and expressing your opinion. You have a lot of support from folks on the call about that. I had a question from somebody in a let me go back and find it real quick. Sorry, it was a direct message. Okay, this question is from someone said, I think Takhona touched on this at kind of a high level, but I'm more interested in some concrete strategies. It sounds like you're saying that because of the importance of empathy, the audience is just as important to the storytelling process as the narrator's perspective. How do you suggest others start to integrate this idea into their own approaches and strategies around storytelling?
I think first things first, what is the goal you're trying to achieve? I think that when you refine that, everything else sort of then you're able to have a game plan for what follows next. And so what is the story that I'm trying to get out? What is the gap in information that I'm trying to fill with that story? And where are the places where I feel like there's been a lack of empathy? And so that's the goal setting. And once you have the goal setting, I think identifying the people that, and this is difficult, right? But the people that are most affected or closest to the topic that you're trying to talk about. And so I think this relates back to Anna's question, that sometimes that is putting pressure on people to share stories, and they might not want to do that. But I think it's always important to bring people to the table when we're discussing issues that directly affect them. And so that's always my go-to. And I think that it always goes back to, if we're being authentic, if we're being honest, if we're being doing no harm in the way that we want to tell different stories, I think that if that plays into the plan and that plays into the goal setting as well, I think that comes off to people, both the audience hearing the story, people can see that, people can feel that. Yes, I'm sorry if that's not too clearly refined a game plan, but those are just my initial ideas off the top of my head.
Wonderful, absolutely great. I think we have time for one more question or observation if anyone wants to chime in.
I have a quick one. I'll chime in. So
Thanks,
you mentioned seeing and being seen. And from my brief time in South Africa, I think in Zulu, that's how we greet each other. When I first got to Chapel Hill from England, I was surprised at the way people greet each other. They say, "How you doing?" And the answer to that is, "How you doing?" or something like that. It seemed to me just not to click. So what's your experience coming from originally Swaziland to Chapel Hill about how people greet each other in your home country where you were born and then in Chapel Hill?
Oh man, I am so excited. I'm like jumping right now that somebody recognized that to see and feel seen and be seen. And that's the exact same way in my mother language as well. So I speak Siswati and it's very close to Zulu. I can read and understand Zulu as well. And so we do use those words. Sawubona, ngiyakubona, I see you. Do you see me? And that for me, I don't think I realized how profound that was until it was abruptly removed from my life. And I went from I see you to how are you doing? Good. And the answer is always good, right? And it's no one actually ever goes beyond that. And so that was interesting for me. And I started thinking about at home what that meant when we said "Ngiyakubona, ngiyakubona," and the people, I mean, whoever created the language and decided to use these as our formal greetings. And what it is that we're trying to convey to us about human connection, about connecting with people, especially when you first meet them, and saying those words, I see you, I see you. It's incredibly powerful. It's powerful. And even though back home, I mean, we don't intellectually think about it anymore. We just say, Sawubona, ngiyakubona. I see you, you see me. There's something I think that I still carry in me that I feel is missing when I'm reducing my salutations to, hi, how are you doing? And that is all. So I definitely feel the gap. And it's only made me think of, what are the other things that I missed in my own culture or never realized the significance of and the profoundness of. And so it's been an interesting journey, just thinking back to some of those things. And also learning new things about the culture here and some of the things that I really appreciate as well. I mentioned leaving the door open for the next person. That was wild to me. Like, you're going to spend 2 minutes of your day holding the door open for me. And so I'm just learning new things as well to appreciate.
Thanks.
Takhona, as a retired physician, when I was out in public with my wife, she would always say, don't ask people how they're doing, because they would always tell me how they were doing.
True, it's a dangerous question in that profession. So I will point you to the chat because Takhona has put together a list of resources for further reading. Emily has shared it there in the chat feed, so you may want to copy and paste that down very quickly. And also, if you want to follow up with us, we'll be happy to send that along to you if you don't have time to get it all down. Takhona, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to gather together again as a community and to think really deeply about the stories we tell and the stories of others. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for joining and for engaging with me. I was super excited to answer all of your questions. Thank you.